How did a fragile 20-year peace completely vanish on a September morning, amidst a fabricated radio broadcast and the roar of steel tracks? The fate of Europe was sealed at cold diplomatic tables within the dark corridors of Berlin and Moscow. Left entirely alone, in the shadow of the empty promises made by Western allies, a young nation was ruthlessly crushed beneath the doctrine of lightning war, Blitzkrieg, a war machine unprecedented up to that day. This documentary examined step by step the relentless advance of German armor from the west, the firestorms ignited by aircraft darkening the sky, and that final lethal hammer blow of the Red Army descending from the east. The final resistance mounted amidst the collapsing ruins of the capital Warsaw, and the ruthless partitioning of a nation by two dictatorships came to light in all its stark reality. The betrayals behind that initial spark, which ignited the bloodiest 6 years in human history, and the replacement of diplomacy with steel and gunpowder, emerged from their murky depths in this profound narrative. If this slow-paced narrative echoing through the silent pages of history resonated with your soul, you might consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel for these enduring journeys. Sharing your valuable suggestions and thoughts in the comments to determine our future course always served as an essential guide for us. Now, take refuge in the silence of your room and slowly drift your mind toward that September morning of 1939, toward the cold waters of Danzig, where the first artillery shell exploded, dragging Europe into an irreversible, long darkness. The victors of the First World War redrew the map of Europe in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles in 1919. Rather than bringing lasting peace to the continent, this map lit the fuse of a massive time bomb that detonated exactly 20 years later. The new states built upon the ruins of fallen empires, and the artificial borders drawn with a ruler on paper created deep and irreparable fractures in the east of Europe. When Adolf Hitler seized absolute power, he decisively turned the direction of the German nation's future and existence toward the east. At the dark core of this vision lay the Lebensraum, or living space doctrine, which targeted the vast agricultural lands and rich underground resources in the east for the German race. This military and political doctrine dictated that borders were no longer drawn at diplomatic tables, but by the advance of armies with steel and gunpowder. During the months of 1938 and 1939, under the bewildered gaze of the international public, and without firing a single bullet, the German armies annexed Austria and then swallowed Czechoslovakia. As the borders of the Third Reich expanded eastward without hindrance, the eyes of Hitler and his generals turned north, toward the shores of the Baltic Sea. The target was the Danzig corridor, which split Germany's eastern territories in two and stood like a scar on the map. Created by the victors after the First World War to give Poland access to the sea and a commercial port, this narrow corridor severed East Prussia from the German motherland. The historic city of Danzig, whose population consisted overwhelmingly of ethnic Germans, was left under the protection of the League of Nations with the status of a free city. This status never quelled the tension in the region. On the contrary, it became a bleeding diplomatic wound for both sides. Adolf Hitler voiced his claims over Danzig with increasingly escalating ferocity and determination, starting from the spring months of 1939. These demands rising from Berlin were not merely a matter of simple border adjustment or port privileges. This was the first step of a heavy psychological war aimed at breaking the resistance of the Polish government, backing them into a corner in the international arena, and ultimately forcing them into total surrender. The diplomatic notes sent from Berlin to Warsaw took on a darker, more threatening tone with each passing day. News reports with specially fabricated details regarding the oppression and persecution of German minorities within the Polish borders were broadcast incessantly in the German press and on the radio. And on the massive cogs of the propaganda machine headed by Joseph Goebbels turned relentlessly, day and night, to psychologically prepare the German people for an impending inevitable war. The military mobilization along the borders reached a highly visible scale toward the end of the summer months. The engine noises of heavy military trucks heard from border towns in the dead of night, and the ammunition trains piling onto the railway lines were the first tangible footsteps of the approaching global hurricane. The language of diplomacy gradually exhausted itself, and the cold steel of weapons took the place of pens on the table to determine the fate of nations. Faced with the German threat that steadily grew and turned into a concrete military buildup on its western border, the Polish government turned its face to London and Paris in desperation. Germany's seemingly unstoppable diplomatic and military expansion completely overturned the old balance of power in Europe. Wishing to put a stop to this dangerous course, Britain and France provided official military and political guarantees to Poland in order to protect the inviolability of its borders. The declaration read by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain in the House of Commons marked a historic turning point in British foreign policy. The years-long appeasement policy was officially shelved, and it was announced to the world that Britain and France intervened with all their might in the event of any threat to Poland's independence. The mutual assistance treaties signed by the two major Western powers with Poland were welcomed as a massive diplomatic victory in Warsaw. Political leaders believed that these guarantees sufficed to halt Hitler's eastward ambitions. This optimistic atmosphere created a dangerous and false sense of security on the streets of Warsaw and within the Polish command echelon. The Polish people drifted away from grasping the colossal magnitude of the approaching danger. This unwavering faith in the support of the West caused the delay of military preparations and contingency plans. Newspaper headlines emphasized the strength of the alliance, while the idea that peace endured under the shadow of two giant allies prevailed in the streets. Instead of updating its defense strategies against modern mechanized troops, the Polish army leaned on the weight of the diplomatic shield expected from the West. However, behind the thick walls of the Chancellery, Reichskanzlei office in Berlin, Adolf Hitler read these diplomatic maneuvers in a starkly different manner. Hitler evaluated these last-minute guarantees from the Western democracies as a desperate and hollow bluff. German intelligence reports and Hitler's personal conviction dictated that Britain and France never dared to return to the trenches for an ally in Eastern Europe and risk an all-out war that swallowed the continent. The bloody memories of the First World War and the anti-war sentiment of the civilian population were seen as the greatest weakness tying the hands of Western leaders. In closed-door meetings with his generals and staff, Hitler repeatedly expressed his certainty that London and Paris left Poland to its own fate at the last moment. These strategic calculations accelerated the gears of the war machine in Berlin even further rather than slowing them down. Hitler put his new plans into action to break the resistance of the Allies, exhaust them with diplomatic crises, and completely isolate Poland before the approaching storm. Responding to the West's move on the diplomatic chessboard in the harshest manner, Germany prepared its final move, not only at the table, but also on the field. The military mobilization along the Polish border, which started months in advance and steadily intensified, shifted from an element of political pressure and turned into the operational preparation for a definitive invasion that leveled the borders. Even if Britain and France declared war, the German staff foresaw that the Siegfried Line, West Wall, on the western border stalled these states. Germany exploited the sluggishness and indecision of the West to devour its eastern neighbor. The fate of Europe rapidly advanced toward being crushed under the weight of approaching steel tracks rather than kept promises. The fate of Europe and the world was redrawn in the cold and dimly lit rooms of the Kremlin Palace, in the heart of Moscow, on the night of August 23rd, 1939. Two regimes, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which until that day saw each other as the greatest existential threat and ideological enemy, and spewed hatred against one another in town squares and on the radio, gathered around the same table. When the plane carrying German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop landed in Moscow, world diplomacy remained unaware that it soon witnessed one of the greatest U-turns history ever saw. Soviet Commissar Vyacheslav Molotov and Ribbentrop sat side by side at the Kremlin signing ceremony, while Soviet leader Joseph Stalin personally followed the process with cold-blooded satisfaction. The official text announced to the world the next morning was a non-aggression pact that remained valid between the two states for 10 years. This news created a virtual earthquake effect in all world capitals, primarily in Paris, London, and Warsaw. The handshake of two polar opposites sworn to destroy each other, such as communism and National Socialism, rendered international alliance systems meaningless overnight. The strategy of France and Britain to use the Soviet Union as a bulwark against Hitler collapsed entirely. In Warsaw, this news served as the first tangible and terrifying signal that the threat coming from the West now began to encircle them from the East as well. However, the true destructive power of this pact lay not in its articles reflected in newspaper headlines, but in the text of the secret additional protocol, which only a very narrow elite group knew and kept as a secret for decades. The two dictatorships ruthlessly divided Eastern Europe among themselves. On the borderline of spheres of influence drawn with a ruler, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and a part of Romania were left to Soviet control, while the Polish territories were split right down the middle. The Nerev, Vistula, and San rivers were accepted as the geographical lines determining the ultimate border between the two occupying powers. Poland, fragmented repeatedly over the centuries, was once again wiped off the map on paper. This secret signature definitively sealed the diplomatic and military death warrant of Poland. Thanks to this agreement, Adolf Hitler completely eliminated the risk of a two-front war, the greatest nightmare of German military strategy. Before entering a potential conflict with Britain and France on the Western Front, he secured his eastern border with Soviet assurance. Stalin, on the other hand, seized the opportunity to watch the beginning of a great war, where the imperialist powers of the West exhausted each other from a comfortable distance, and to effortlessly reclaim the lost former Tsarist territories. This pragmatic partnership, in which neither leader trusted the other, completely closed the circle around Poland. As the final grains in the hourglass rapidly depleted, the last political obstacle in front of the German war machine to pull the trigger vanished just like that. To the west of the Polish border, the German war machine initiated a colossal and terrifying buildup unseen on the European continent until that day. The invasion plan, Fall Weiss, Case White, prepared months in advance with meticulous calculations by the German High Command, ensured that all military gears turned in flawless harmony. In the final days of August, thousands of armored vehicles silenced their engines in the depths of the forests along the borderline and under camouflage nets. Mechanized units, heavy artillery batteries, and fully equipped infantry divisions took assault positions. Logistics trains transported ammunition, fuel, and soldiers day and night without pause. The German army under the command of Generaloberst Walter von Brauchitsch, began waiting for the final order to cross the border and encircle Poland from three flanks. On the German side of the border, everything remained in an eerie silence and complete operational readiness. To the east of the border, in the General Staff headquarters in Warsaw, the atmosphere was vastly different. Polish Commander-in-Chief Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły clearly saw the inevitable magnitude of the disaster looming on the horizon. Intelligence reports showing that German troops enveloped the border in the shape of a giant crescent piled up on his desk. The Marshal made the decision to declare general mobilization in order to implement the defense strategy known as Plan Zachod, Plan West, position his troops on the defense lines at the border, and deploy the entire military strength of the country to the field. Due to the slow-moving structure and vast geography of the Polish army, critical time was needed for the troops to reach the front. As the final grains in the hourglass fell rapidly, every passing hour worked against Poland. However, in these critical moments, Poland's allies, Britain and France, made a diplomatic intervention. London and Paris applied heavy bureaucratic pressure on Warsaw in order not to provoke Berlin, not to give Hitler the excuse that Poland was the aggressor, and not to ignite the fuse of a final diplomatic crisis. British and French ambassadors persistently demanded that the Polish government postpone the declaration of mobilization. Western leaders clung to a hope entirely detached from reality, believing that diplomacy still solved the conflict at the table. To avoid angering the allies they vitally needed and losing political support, the Polish government withdrew Marshal Rydz-Śmigły's mobilization order at the last moment on August 29th. This diplomatic postponement decision turned into an absolute disaster for the Polish defense. A brief chaos erupted in the chain of command within the army. Troops heading toward the stations were halted, train schedules were canceled, and the military logistics network took a heavy blow. When the mistake was realized and the general mobilization order was finally given officially on August 30th, 24 golden hours were lost forever. With mere hours left until the start of the war, hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers still waited for trains in their barracks or at the stations. A large portion of the divisions tasked with protecting the border failed to settle into their defense lines. The Polish army lost the most critical preparation phase of the war, not in the face of enemy barrels, but due to the bureaucratic pressure and diplomatic blindness of its allies. While the heavy armor of the Fall Weiss plan warmed up their engines, the Polish front was forced to meet the inevitable blow understaffed. The situation inside the country deteriorated as communication lines faced potential disruption, leaving the high command in a state of paralysis, while the German threat loomed just miles away, ready to shatter the fragile peace that had persisted for 2 decades. The final act of the political crisis was written kilometers away from the front, in the dark corridors of the SS headquarters in Berlin. Adolf Hitler needed a pretext, an undeniable casus belli, cause for war, to convince the German people and the global public of a massive war. The planning of this dirty and covert mission was handed to Reinhard Heydrich, the ruthless architect of the Gestapo and the SS organization. Bearing the codename Operation Himmler, this secret plan went down in military history records as a flawless false flag operation. When the calendars showed the evening of August 31st, 1939, that ominous lie, which soon set the European continent ablaze, was practically staged. The target was the local radio station in the German border town of Gleiwitz, located only a few kilometers away from the Polish border. A special 7-man SS strike team dressed in civilian clothes, but speaking fluent Polish, under the command of SS Major Alfred Nojoks, surrounded the station as darkness fell. Around 2000 at night, this team, disguised as so-called Polish insurgents, launched a sudden raid on the radio building by firing their weapons into the air. The unarmed civilian employees of the station were immediately restrained and locked in the basement of the building. The most critical stage of the operation was seizing the microphones and broadcasting that fake uprising message to the world. The raiders stepped up to the microphone after connecting to the main broadcast line. An SS officer read a fiery manifesto in flawless Polish. The message was very short, but the political meaning it carried was fatal. Attention, this is Gleiwitz. The radio station is in Polish hands. The time for the uprising against the Germans has come. This radio broadcast, which lasted only a few minutes and cut out amidst static, was more than enough for the propaganda wheels of war to turn. However, much more concrete and bloody evidence than a verbal broadcast was needed to prove the credibility of the operation in the eyes of international observers. This spine-chilling evidence, referred to by the code canned goods, Konserven, in SS terminology, was prepared days in advance. Political prisoners secretly brought from Gestapo cells and concentration camps were transported to the borderline in closed trucks. These prisoners were dressed in original Polish army uniforms, previously procured by intelligence units. Placed around the radio station and in its courtyard, these victims were rendered semi-conscious with poison injections by SS doctors, and then executed by being shot from close range. The corpses were strategically scattered at the entrance of the building and at the door of the broadcast room, just like real Polish soldiers killed in a fierce firefight. With the first light of morning, the German police force and state-controlled local journalists were specially invited to the crime scene. Camera flashes popped, and photographs of the blood-soaked corpses in Polish uniforms were carefully taken. In just a few hours, the massive propaganda machine, directed by Joseph Goebbels, carried these crime scene photos to the headlines of all German newspapers. News bulletins announced on the radios that Poland launched a despicable and unprovoked armed attack on German territory, and the German army was left with no choice but to respond to this provocative assault with force. The lie that pulled the trigger of war transformed into the official truth of the state overnight. While the crime scene photos entered the morning edition in Berlin, and furious diplomatic telegrams were sent to Western capitals, the long-awaited forward order already reached the panzer divisions, whose engines ran for days in the forests just beyond the border. On the morning of September 1st, 1939, a dense layer of fog drifting from the cold waters of the Baltic Sea completely blanketed the port of Danzig. The SMS Schleswig-Holstein, an old First World War battleship, turned its gun barrels into the darkness of the harbor, where it had been anchored for days under the guise of a goodwill visit. The ship's commander, Kapitän Zursay Gustav Kleikamp, silently checked his watch on the bridge. The moment the hands of the clock struck exactly 4:45 a.m., the battleship's massive 280mm naval guns fired under a definitive order. Flames erupting from the barrels tore through the morning fog, and seconds later, the first heavy artillery shells struck Poland's Westerplatte military transit depot with a deafening roar. The first shot, which initiated the bloodiest and most destructive 6 years in human history, was fired not at diplomatic tables, but in the cold waters of Danzig. The small Polish garrison located on the Westerplatte Peninsula consisted of only around 200 soldiers under the command of Major Henryk Sucharski. The soldiers sprang from their beds at the ear-shattering explosions. The heavy shells of the old and dilapidated battleship ripped apart concrete bunkers, watchtowers, and brick barracks. Trees were uprooted, and soil was hurled into the air. German naval infantry, Marine Stostrup Company, launched a ground assault to seize the peninsula immediately after the heavy artillery bombardment. However, the Polish soldiers quickly overcame the initial shock, settled into their trenches, and bloodily repelled this first wave of attack with machine gun fire. The rapid surrender planned in Berlin did not materialize. The Westerplatte resistance began on the first morning of the war with an unexpected and fierce stubbornness. In those minutes, when the sounds of artillery echoed in the Gulf of Danzig, a far more ruthless and modern plan went into effect in the sky, hundreds of kilometers southwest of the border. The town of Weilun, located just 21 kilometers from the German border, was an ordinary civilian settlement possessing no strategic importance, military unit, air defense battery, or defense industry. The townspeople were in a deep sleep, entirely unaware of the looming catastrophe. Around 4:40 a.m., black dots appearing on the horizon gradually grew larger, and heavy engine noises filled the skies of Weilun. Junkers Ju-87. Stuka dive bombers belonging to the Luftwaffe, under the command of Captain Walter Siegel, locked onto their target to wipe the town off the map. The first bombs gliding from the sky struck the local hospital, which bore a massive Red Cross sign on its roof and was the town's most prominent structure. The hospital building collapsed in a massive fireball, burying the patients and doctors inside under the rubble. This was not an accidental strike, but the first brutal step of the total war doctrine aimed at generating terror and panic. The Stukas dived with the ear-piercing, terrifying screams of their wind-driven sirens, relentlessly dropping hundreds of kilograms of bombs onto the marketplace, historical buildings, civilian homes, and streets. While the intensity of the explosions shook buildings from their foundations, bullets rained down from the aircraft's machine guns onto civilians who woke up and fled into the streets. Following systematic waves of bombardment that lasted only a few hours, more than 70% of the town turned completely into a pile of rubble. The de facto beginning of the Second World War occurred not through the honorable clash of regular armies fighting on a front, as in ancient times, but through an uninterrupted storm of steel raining down upon sleeping civilians and caught off guard border guards. Diplomatic calculations made over months in grand offices across Berlin, London, and Paris, accompanied by thick cigars, gave way on the morning of September 1st to the smell of gunpowder, screams, and the flames of burning cities. Hitler's vision of eastward expansion and living space, Lebensraum, lifted off the paper and descended with all its weight upon Europe's land, sky, and seas. As the sun rose over the eastern borders of Europe on the morning of September 1st, the dewdrops on the ground were crushed under the weight of a colossal war machine. More than 1.5 million German soldiers who waited silently along the borderline throughout the night swung into action immediately after the initial preparatory fire of the artillery batteries. In the north, Army Group North, under the command of General Fedor von Bock, and in the south, Army Group South, under the command of General Gerd von Rundstedt, breached the border from end to end. Border posts were uprooted, and barbed wire was torn apart beneath tank tracks. Two massive military jaws closed simultaneously to swallow Polish territory. This event was not merely a routine border violation, but the dawn of a new and dark era in military strategy. World military history, after the stagnant attrition warfare of the First World War that bogged down in trenches for months amidst mud and blood, became acquainted with the concept of lightning war, or Blitzkrieg, in all its naked reality for the first time. This doctrine, which the German High Command devised behind closed doors for years, aimed not at gradually exhausting the enemy through months of battles, but at paralyzing them suddenly through speed, armored power, and the element of surprise. Motorized infantry, heavy artillery, and armored units moved like a single, massive mechanical organism in an unprecedented harmony. Speed transformed into a weapon on the battlefield as lethal as firepower itself. One of the most relentless practitioners of this new doctrine on the field was General Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of modern armored warfare. The 19th Panzer Corps, commanded personally by Guderian, drove like a ruthless steel wedge into the Polish corridor that would reconnect East Prussia to Germany. Hundreds of light and medium panzer tanks advanced across the Polish plain amidst exhaust fumes and deafening engine noise. Steel tracks crushed the makeshift defense lines, barbed wires, and shallow anti-tank trenches that lay ahead. Instead of directly assaulting the fortifications where the enemy was strongest, German armored divisions bypassed them, located and breached the weakest points of the lines, and flowed ceaselessly deep into the defenses. On the opposing front, the Polish army, waiting along the borders to defend their homeland, attempted to withstand this modern mechanized assault with traditional infantry and cavalry tactics. Polish units put up a heroic resistance with anti-tank guns and small arms in forested areas, at bridgeheads, and at town entrances. Yet the enemy they faced consisted not just of numerically superior soldiers, but of an unstoppable, constantly flowing mechanical wave. The defense lines established by Polish commanders on maps fell far behind the massive breaches carved out by the panzer divisions within hours. The very concept of a front line lost all meaning. The war was no longer fought on a single plain, but deep within the interior of the country amidst sheer chaos. This incredible operational speed of the mechanized units, advancing dozens of kilometers a day, generated an unprecedented shockwave and a profound tactical paralysis within the Polish High Command in Warsaw. The rare frontline reports reaching the headquarters of Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły lost their validity the moment they passed from the hands of couriers to the table. In the hours it took staff officers to mark German positions on maps, those armored units had already advanced miles further east. The slow-moving infantry divisions and horse-drawn logistics columns of the Polish army failed to keep pace with the speed of the German mechanized units and rapidly faced the threat of encirclement. This immense operational speed, generated by steel tracks, tore defense plans apart on paper before the ink could even dry. The fate of the Polish campaign was rapidly determined not only by the armor crushing the ground below, but also in the vast expanse of the sky. The Polish Air Force put up a heroic but desperate resistance against the German Luftwaffe, which possessed an overwhelming numerical and technological superiority. Scrambling from hidden forest airstrips, obsolete PZLP-11, Polish fighter planes rose into the sky against the Messerschmitt Bf-109s, some of the most modern war machines of the era. Polish pilots entered deadly dogfights, completely disregarding their own lives to defend their homeland, and managed to shoot down a surprising number of German aircraft in the opening days. However, in the face of the massive volume of German air fleets that darkened the skies, these individual acts of heroism did not suffice to alter the general course of the war. Initiative in the skies fell completely into Germany's hands during the very first hours of the war. The true destructive power of the Luftwaffe manifested not in frontline clashes, but in strategic bombardment waves that paralyzed the nervous system of the Polish state and army. Colossal fleets composed of twin-engine Heinkel He 111 and Dornier Du 17 bombers penetrated deep into Poland, simultaneously striking all the country's railway networks, strategic river bridges, and major logistics hubs. Military trains carrying reinforcements to the front became sitting ducks on the rails. Wooden cars blew up, along with the ammunition inside, and transit lines transformed into twisted heaps of iron. The Polish army's capacity to mobilize and shift units was completely locked down by these heavy blows from above before the divisions could even reach their planned defensive positions. The most critical and fatal target of the aerial campaign was the country's communication infrastructure. German bombers specifically targeted telephone exchanges in major cities, long telegraph lines running through rural areas, and radio broadcast stations. With miles of cables severed and transmitter towers buried under rubble, vital contact among Polish military units collapsed entirely. In an era when military coordination and the chain of command heavily relied on wired field telephones, the sudden silence from receivers spelled an absolute operational catastrophe. Radio stations fell silent one by one, and local commanders fighting in disparate sectors of the front were left entirely isolated in the midst of massive chaos, stranded on their own without knowing the next step. This sudden collapse of the communication network completely blinded the central headquarters in Warsaw in just a few hours. Polish Commander-in-Chief Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły and his staff looked on helplessly at silent maps that no longer reflected reality, receiving no updated intelligence, calls for help, or status reports from the front. Issuing coordinated orders to the field, directing reserve units to breached lines, or forming an organized defensive perimeter became physically impossible without a flow of communication. The Polish army's pre-war strategic plans, which envisioned slowing the enemy advance and gradually retreating to regroup behind the rivers, dissolved in the information vacuum and turmoil of the very first days. The loss of the sky resulted in the direct loss of the command and control mechanism, condemning tens of thousands of Polish soldiers to fight within a colossal operational blindness without being able to find their direction. With the complete collapse of the communication network, Polish divisions scattered across the vast front line, extending from the western border to the interior regions, were left entirely to their own fate within the deafening information vacuum brought by modern warfare. Unable to receive orders from central headquarters and unaware of the fate of neighboring units, local commanders attempted to fill the fatal blanks on their maps using their own initiative. Yet the ruthless speed of the German war machine rendered these disconnected and desperate efforts futile within hours. German motorized infantry and spearhead armored columns flowed like a massive torrent of steel around Polish units, waiting in fixed defensive lines, dug into trenches. Pinned down by heavy artillery fire from the front, it was already too late when the Polish divisions realized that their flanks lay completely defenseless. Colossal encirclement pockets closed, one after another, within forests, villages, and towns. Thrusting deep behind the enemy, German tanks cut off escape routes, bridges, and strategic intersections one by one. Tightening at every point of the front, this noose contracted further with each passing hour through fire and steel. The pre-war last resort plan of the Polish High Command was to pull the main body of the army east of the Vistula River and establish a formidable, natural line of defense behind those wide waters. But this strategy, which appeared logical on the drawing board, came to absolutely nothing on the field because the German mechanized units advanced far faster than the marching Polish infantry. Attempting to transport their heavy equipment via horse carts or on foot, thousands of Polish soldiers came face to face with German motorized vanguards before they could reach the river crossings. The bridgeheads leading east were captured by the enemy long before the Polish units arrived. Hope of crossing to the other side of the river dissolved amidst the exhaust fumes of armored vehicles. The delay in the retreat order and the sudden unraveling at the front led to unprecedented chaos on the country's roads. fleeing the horrors of war, leaving their homes behind to load their remaining belongings onto makeshift horse carts. Hundreds of thousands of civilian refugees poured onto dirt roads, choked with dust and smoke. These endless columns of civilians mingled on the same narrow roads with exhausted, sleep-deprived, and disorganized military units trying desperately to withdraw eastward. Military logistics ground to a complete halt. Artillery batteries became trapped among refugee columns, and ammunition trucks failed to advance. The roads overflowed with gridlocked vehicles, terrified civilians, and spent soldiers. For the Luftwaffe squadrons holding absolute dominance in the sky, this massive and bottlenecked sea of humanity crawling below was a wide-open, defenseless target. Low-flying Messerschmitt fighters and Stuka squadrons dove ruthlessly onto the crowds with engine roars that tore the wind. Hundreds of rounds pouring from the aircraft's machine guns within seconds cut down the columns on the roads without distinguishing between soldier and civilian. Burning horse carts, shattered military equipment, overturned trucks, and lifeless bodies cast to the sides of the roads turned the retreat routes across the Polish plain into a literal highway of death. The Polish army's hope of a structured retreat and regrouping was utterly crushed beneath steel tracks and bullets raining from the sky along these chaotic, blood-soaked roads. In the midst of narrowing encirclement pockets across the country, severed communication lines, and deepening despair, a colossal clash erupted that would temporarily alter the course of the war. The Poznan army, under the command of General Tadeusz Kuturzeba, which had managed to evade the center of the German advance and relatively preserved its combat integrity, detected a major tactical vulnerability on the left flank of the German Eighth Army, advancing rapidly toward Warsaw. The German mechanized unit's ambition to reach the capital left their own flanks exposed and vulnerable. In order to exploit this fatal error and alleviate the pressure on the capital, General Kuturzeba gathered all his available strength and launched a fierce counteroffensive along the banks of the Bzura River. On the evening of September 9th, as the sun vanished over the horizon, Polish infantry and cavalry brigades crossed the shallow waters of the river and came down like a sledgehammer upon the lines of the German 30th Infantry Division. The numerical superiority of the Polish units and the shock effect of the surprise element caused a major rupture in the German front. German troops, who for days had done nothing but advance and were intoxicated by victory, saw their own lines breached and themselves pushed backward for the first time. Polish soldiers cleared German trenches one by one through bayonet charges and close quarters combat. Thousands of German soldiers were taken prisoner, and numerous artillery batteries and ammunition depots were captured. The Blitzkrieg war machine stumbled for the first time along the marshy banks of the Bzura, and its advance ground to a temporary halt. Yet the wind of hope generated by this tactical victory proved short-lived. The German High Command, OKH, quickly recognized the mortal peril created by this massive breach on their flank and shifted all operational priorities to the Bzura pocket. General Gerd von Rundstedt issued a definitive turn-back order to the armored divisions advancing toward Warsaw. The panzers and motorized units of the German 10th Army changed direction, beginning to forge a colossal steel vise around the Polish Poznan army. Having lost the element of surprise, the Polish troops were forced to halt their advance and transition to defensive positions in the face of the relentless fire of heavy armor and 88mm anti-tank guns. The blow that decided the ultimate fate of the battle came not from the ground, but once again from the sky. Starting on the morning of September 16th, nearly all bomber squadrons belonging to the Luftwaffe were directed to the skies over the Bzura River. Hundreds of Junkers, Ju-87, Stuka dive bombers turned the forests, bridgeheads, and staging areas where the Polish army took refuge into an absolute hell through relentless day-long dives. Bereft of anti-aircraft weapons, the Polish soldiers were left completely defenseless under this rain of steel that darkened the skies. The violence of the bombs ignited forest fires, and the waters of the river were stained crimson, with blood mixing into the soil. A military counteroffensive turned into a one-sided slaughter within hours. By September 19th, the combat strength of the Poznan army was completely shattered under the encirclement of German armor and the continuous bombardment of the Luftwaffe. General Kuturzba managed to break through the German ring with a small remaining faction of his army and withdraw toward the forests of Warsaw. But the main body of the army was annihilated. 170,000 Polish soldiers were taken prisoner, and tens of thousands were buried in mass graves along the banks of the Bzura. The last organized and great light of hope for the war that began along the borders was completely extinguished in the waters of the Bzura. For Poland, the era of pitched battles was now over. Next remained only a final, desperate struggle for survival to be waged amidst the ruins of the capital. By mid-September, the course of the war over Polish territory grew increasingly grim for the defenders. The armored divisions of the German Wehrmacht pressed on relentlessly from the west, north, and south, with their superior firepower and inconceivable speed. Front lines ruptured, communication networks collapsed, and the main body of the Polish army was forced to retreat continuously eastward. In this moment of profound crisis, the Polish High Command and Commander-in-Chief, Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły, put their last major strategic plan into action to prevent the complete annihilation of the army and buy time, the Romanian bridgehead, Przedmoście Rumuńskie strategy. According to this plan, all surviving Polish units withdrew to the southeast, to the mountainous and forested region where the borders of Romania and the Soviet Union intersected. By utilizing the natural defensive lines of the Dniester and Stry rivers, the intention was to halt the advance of the German mechanized units in this unforgiving terrain. The objective was not to achieve a military victory, but rather to survive until France and Britain launched their promised major offensive against Germany on the Western Front. Military trains, ammunition convoys, and exhausted infantry divisions turned their course to the southeast in a final glimmer of hope. Logistics centers moved to this region, and preparations began for the weapons, ammunition, and fuel assistance that would arrive from the Allies via the Black Sea and Romania. However, on the morning of September 17th, 1939, one of the darkest diplomatic betrayals in European history descended directly onto the battlefield. On Poland's eastern borders, known as Kraje, which remained relatively untouched by the devastation of the war until that day, a massive cloud of dust blanketed the horizon at dawn. The Red Army units belonging to the Soviet Union, which waited silently just across the border throughout the night, breached the border from end to end without delivering any diplomatic note or issuing a formal declaration of war. Two colossal army groups, organized under the names of the Belarusian Front in the north and the Ukrainian Front in the south, entered Polish territory with more than 800,000 soldiers, over 4,000 tanks, and countless artillery batteries. During those same hours, a cold and tense diplomatic theater unfolded in Moscow. Deputy People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Potemkin, summoned Polish Ambassador Wacław Grzybowski to the ministry around 3 o'clock in the morning. Potemkin presented the ambassador with an official note stating that the Polish state and its government effectively collapsed. Therefore, all treaties between the Soviet Union and Poland were invalidated. And the Red Army crossed the border to ensure the safety of the Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities in the east. Polish Ambassador Grzybowski definitively refused to accept this degrading and unlawful note, stating that his country still fought and resisted alongside its allies. Yet, this honorable stance at the diplomatic table did not halt the advance of the steel tracks on the field. The small number of Polish Border Protection Corps (KOP) soldiers standing guard along the borders experienced profound shock and confusion when they saw massive armored columns coming toward them in the early hours of the morning. Polish officers at some border outposts assumed that the Soviet tanks and soldiers appearing on the horizon came to help them against Germany. For, in the minds of the Polish troops, the possibility of an invasion from the east did not exist at that moment. However, the first heavy fire opened by the Red Army units, and the bullets raining down on the border guards shattered this brief and tragic illusion. The secret partition protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed behind the closed doors of Moscow in August, turned into reality with steel, gunpowder, and blood on the morning of September 17th. When the news of the breached eastern borders reached the Polish High Command, which withdrew to the southeastern town of Kolomija, the tense anticipation at the headquarters gave way to absolute despair. The Polish army, ruthlessly beaten on the German anvil for days, was now crushed right down the middle by the blow of a colossal Soviet hammer descending from the east. The nightmare of a two-front war became a reality in its most destructive form. The plan to withdraw to the Romanian bridgehead and maintain the defense collapsed entirely in the very first hours, as fast-moving cavalry and armored brigades belonging to the Red Army rapidly severed the vital road and railway networks leading to this region. The Polish army lacked any preparation, defense in depth, or adequate military units to fight an enemy of this magnitude in the east. While almost the entire army fought a life-and-death struggle against the Germans in the west, the eastern flank was caught completely defenseless. Commander-in-Chief Marshal Rydz-Śmigły made one of the most difficult and agonizing decisions in history, broadcasting this historic order to all his troops over the radio. Do not engage in combat with the Soviet forces. Fire back only if you are fired upon, or if an attempt is made to disarm you, and immediately retreat toward the borders of Romania and Hungary. Yet this order, instead of ending the chaos at the front, deepened it further. Which unit would fight against the Germans? Which unit would fight against the Soviets? And who would retreat, where became entirely ambiguous. Due to severed communication lines, many units never heard this order and engaged in local, bloody, and desperate clashes against the Red Army advancing in the east. Squeezed between two colossal military machines, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Poland no longer had any strategic sanctuary or any possibility of military recovery. This sudden hammer blow from the east on the morning of September 17th buried in the ground not only the Romanian bridgehead plan, but also the last crumbs of hope a nation carried for survival. The massive invasion launched by the Red Army crossing the eastern borders directly threatened not only Poland's military defense plans, but also the physical existence of the state itself. On the afternoon of September 17th, the Polish government and the high command echelon, located near the southeastern town of Kuti, understood with absolute certainty that remaining in the country would now result in captivity or death. The armies of two ruthless dictatorships closed in from both sides of the country like a giant Weiss. The Polish state once again arrived at the edge of that dark abyss it experienced before in its centuries-old history. President Ignacy Mościcki, Prime Minister Felicjan Sławoj Składkowski, and Commander-in-Chief Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły made a painful assessment of the situation. The decision reached was not a surrender, but a desperate step taken to ensure the legal continuity of the state. The government and the military command delegation would cross the border to seek refuge in neutral Romania and establish a government in exile to continue the war from France. On the night connecting September 17th to September 18th, the wooden bridge over the Seramosh River, which marked the border between Poland and Romania, witnessed a historic and solemn crossing. In pitch darkness, on a rainy night illuminated by vehicle headlights, the highest-ranking officials of the Polish state walked onto the bridge with heavy steps. Cabinet members, high-ranking staff officers, and convoys carrying the state's official documents crossed into Romanian territory, leaving behind a burning, occupied, and dying country. Faces were grim. No one uttered a single word. The Polish state physically abandoned its lands. However, this strategic retreat plan quickly struck a major diplomatic obstacle. Under intense political pressure from the Germans, the Romanian government interned the Polish president, prime minister, and commander-in-chief, who entered across its border, placing them under surveillance. The exiled leader's hope of reaching allied countries and directing the army from the outside ended entirely with this forced detention in Romania. The departure of the head of state and the high command from the country created an unprecedented operational void for the hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers who continued to fight on the field. With the central headquarters moving beyond the border, the army became completely beheaded overnight. The nationwide chain of command broke over the waters of the Seramosh River that night. Military coordination, the logistics distribution network, and the flow of central intelligence collapsed instantly. Units fighting valiantly on the front lines waited by their radios for a new tactical order or a retreat route from the center. But the only thing echoing on the frequencies was a deep, static noise and absolute silence. Couriers disappeared on ruined roads along with the messages they needed to deliver, unable to find the command centers. Caught between the relentless fire of German armored divisions in the west and the unstoppable advance of the Red Army in the east, the Polish army experienced one of the greatest isolations seen in modern military history. Divisions, brigades, and regiments, fighting in completely surrounded pockets hundreds of kilometers apart, were entirely unaware of the fate of the capital or the government. Their ammunition reached the point of depletion. Medical supplies ran out, and the soldiers wrestled with days of sleeplessness and hunger. The situation on the tactical maps shifted from a regular army defense to independent islands of resistance scattered to the four corners of the country. However, the local commanders made a historic decision that transcended military logic. Each front commander declared the forest he occupied, the town he defended, or the bridgehead he held as his own independent fortress. The nature of the war changed. This was no longer a strategic defense, but an epic final stand, born out of absolute desperation and defying death. As the front lines across the country collapsed one by one, the entire weight and destructive focus of the war turned toward the heart of Poland, Warsaw. Starting from the second week of September, the German armored ring around the capital slowly narrowed day by day, and the city fell under a total siege. The German Eighth Army advancing from the west, and the Third Army completing the encirclement from the east, severed all of Warsaw's land connections with the outside world. The historic metropolis, once one of Europe's most vibrant cultural hubs, suddenly transformed into a lethal trap surrounded by a wall of steel, forcing its inhabitants into an unavoidable confrontation with the encroaching forces. Inside the city, an unparalleled spirit of resistance blended with despair began to sprout. General Juliusz Rommel, commander of the Warsaw Army, tasked with defending the capital, transformed the city into a massive fortress by assembling the last regular units he had left, scattered retreating divisions, and volunteer civilian militias. The distinction between soldier and civilian disappeared entirely. The elderly, women, and even children stood shoulder to shoulder with the soldiers, digging up the streets and building impenetrable anti-tank barricades out of overturned tram cars, uprooted paving stones, and sandbags. The city's elegant boulevards, parks, and historic squares turned into the bloody labyrinths of a ruthless urban warfare. The armored vanguards and motorized infantry of the German army launched fierce assaults on the outer suburbs, calculating that they could topple the city with a swift blow. However, German units attempting to advance in districts such as Wola, Ochota, and Mokotów met intense machine gun fire, raining down from windows, rooftops, and basements. Polish defenders hunted down the German panzers, entering the narrow streets one by one with their limited anti-tank weapons and improvised explosives. This stubborn and bloody defense, continuing street by street and building by building, inflicted heavy casualties on the German high command. The reality that Warsaw could not be brought down by infantry power and street skirmishes caused great outrage in Berlin. Seeking to break this stubborn resistance, boost the morale of its soldiers, and free up divisions to be shifted to other fronts, the German High Command made one of the most ruthless decisions modern military history had seen up to that day. The will of the city would be crushed by absolute destruction from the air, by a firestorm rained down upon the civilians. On the morning of September 25th, 1939, on that dark day that would go down in history as Black Monday, the color of the sky changed. More than 400 bombers belonging to the Luftwaffe reached the skies of Warsaw in waves at sunrise, targeting civilian centers directly while disregarding any military objectives. Following the wail of sirens, hundreds of tons of high explosives were poured onto the city. Massive buildings shook from their foundations and collapsed inward like houses of cards. Hospitals and schools turned into rubble in seconds. The incendiary bombs ignited colossal firestorms in Warsaw's old neighborhoods, fueled by the wind. German planes destroyed the main water pumping stations, leaving fire brigades unable to combat the flames. By evening, a pitch-black cloud of smoke hung over Warsaw. Over 10% of the city was reduced to ashes in just 10 hours. The dazzling European capital transformed into a massive mass grave, reeking of blood and smoke, illuminated only by the flames. Following the unprecedented devastation wrought by Black Monday, the situation in Warsaw pushed far beyond the limits of human endurance. The bombs, raining down incessantly on the city from German artillery and Luftwaffe aircraft, entirely collapsed the capital's infrastructure. With the destruction of the water network, not a single drop of water could be found to combat the massive fires erupting in the streets. For the hundreds of thousands of civilians crammed into the city's dark cellars and underground shelters, thirst became an enemy as lethal as the explosives falling from the sky. People were forced to drink the contaminated water, pooling in the muddy craters carved by artillery shells amidst the burning buildings. The city's food depots turned to ash, and a severe famine broke out in the streets. The scenes inside the hospitals laid bare the most ruthless face of total war in all its nakedness. Operating rooms plunged into pitch darkness as the generators were torn apart. Doctors struggled to treat thousands of severely wounded individuals under the weak, flickering light of gas lamps, without anesthesia, painkillers, or bandages. The condition of the soldiers at the barricades and in the trenches was no different from that of the civilians. Ammunition crates emptied completely, and anti-aircraft batteries fell silent. The Polish soldiers, defending the capital, chambered the last bullets they held and settled into a desperate, dark anticipation. Unable to remain a spectator any longer to the indescribable agony experienced by the civilians, and the looming threat of epidemic diseases, General Julius Rommel made that heaviest of decisions on September 28, 1939. The Warsaw garrison laid down its arms to prevent the total annihilation of the city. Europe's proud and historic capital surrendered to its enemy amidst ruins and ashes. In those days, when the capital's surrender documents were signed, Poland's geopolitical fate was already sealed miles to the east of the country, in the city of Brest-Litovsk. The secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed behind the closed doors of Moscow in August, were executed on the field with a flawless and ruthless diplomacy. German Wehrmacht troops and the Soviet Red Army came together over the wreckage of a nation wiped off the map to stage one of history's most bizarre and chilling military spectacles. The legendary commander of the German armored forces, General Heinz Guderian, and Soviet commander Semyon Krivoshein stood side by side on a wooden grandstand erected on the main avenue of Brest-Litovsk. German panzers and Soviet tanks took a joint victory lap through the ruined streets of Poland. Swastika and hammer and sickle flags waved side by side on the very same poles. Soldiers of two opposing ideologies shared their cigarettes. Commanders smiled at one another, and officers struck friendly poses upon the lands of a crushed country. This parade was not merely a military celebration, but the official declaration that Poland, in the heart of Europe, was de facto partitioned between two colossal dictatorships. The waters of the Bug River drew the new border between the two empires. The young Polish Republic, which gained its independence by paying heavy prices following the First World War, was completely erased from the map once again beneath tank tracks just 20 years later. The world looked on at the spectacle, witnessing the finality of Poland's military collapse as the two totalitarian powers solidified their grip on the region, sealing the fate of millions who would soon face the full horror of occupation. As the first days of October arrived, the Polish state collapsed legally and practically. The government went into exile, the capital, Warsaw, surrendered in ruins, and the country's territories were divided between two colossal occupying powers. Yet, amidst this unprecedented devastation and absolute defeat, one last regular army unit remained that still refused to lay down its arms and continued to fight. The independent operational group Polesia, Samodzielna Grupa Operacyjna Polesia, under the command of General Franciszek Kleeberg, rejected surrender orders and embarked on a desperate march to break the German encirclement and head south. This unit was a complex yet highly resolute group composed of retreating infantry from the east and west, cavalrymen, civilian volunteers, and even Navy sailors whose ships sank. On the morning of October 2nd, 1939, General Kleeberg's forces came face to face with the German 13th Motorized Infantry Division near the town of Koch. German commanders anticipated that this exhausted, surrounded, and disorganized Polish force standing before them would scatter at the first artillery fire. However, the Koch plain set the stage for one of the most stubborn and surprising resistances of the war. Utilizing the advantage of the forested terrain, Polish cavalry struck the German motorized columns from the flanks. The infantry defended their trenches step by step against German forces that were vastly superior in both numbers and equipment. Throughout the clashes that lasted for days, Polish soldiers pushed the German lines back repeatedly with bayonet charges. The battle raged without interruption throughout the days of October 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Completely encircled, with the sky passing into the absolute dominance of the Luftwaffe and all possibilities of outside support eliminated, these last soldiers fought solely for their national honor. Polish soldiers pushed back against the overwhelming odds. Koch and its surrounding villages were reduced to wreckage by heavy artillery shells. Polish units used their very last grenades and their final magazines against German panzers and heavy machine guns. The soldiers starved for days, suffered from sleep deprivation, and lacked even the basic medical supplies to treat their wounded. Despite this, they did not experience a tactical collapse on the battlefield. The Polish lines did not break, and German assaults were repelled bloodily every single time. However, the ultimate fate of the battle was determined not by the blood spilled on the field or the courage of the soldiers, but by that cold emptiness at the bottom of the ammunition crates. On the night of October 5th, General Kleberg gathered his staff officers one last time in a dark forest camp. The troops did not have a single artillery shell left to fire, nor did the soldiers have a single bullet remaining to chamber into their rifles. The decision was made. The soldiers sabotaged the mechanisms of their weapons and shattered the barrels of their artillery, preventing their equipment from falling intact into German hands. On the morning of October 6, 1939, as the final bullet in the soldier's possession left the barrel, the resistance was forced to an end due to physical impossibilities. General Kleberg raised the white flag of surrender to prevent the senseless slaughter of his men. This fierce resistance they displayed against the German motorized units earned the military respect of even the enemy commanders. With the complete silencing of the weapons on the Koch Plain, the Polish campaign, which began with the first cannon firing in the waters of Danzig on the morning of September 1st and lasted 36 days, came to its military conclusion. This final silence at Koch symbolized not merely the fall of a young 20-year-old republic. The deadly and heavy silence that descended upon the Koch Plain that day became the harbinger of a much larger and more terrifying storm. The erasure of Poland from the map was merely the first spark of a colossal fire that would ignite the bloodiest and most ruthless 6 years in human history. In this new era where diplomacy yielded to steel tracks and peace surrendered to carpet bombings, the long darkness that would engulf all of Europe and the world officially began following that final bullet fired at Koch. That brings us to the end of our video. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions in the comments so we can keep creating even better content for you. Hope to see you in the next video.